So there was a preacher, and he was new to his church. He'd only been there a few months. He was still trying to figure out who everybody was. And after church one day, he had preached, and he was greeting people at the back of the sanctuary, and a man came through and shook his hand, and he said, "Pastor, that was the most boring sermon I've ever heard." And then he went on about his way, and about 2 minutes later, the same man came through the line again. And he said, "That was even more boring than last week, Pastor." And then he went on. About 2 minutes later, he came back through again. He said, "I haven't heard you say anything good for months, Pastor." And after everybody left, the pastor asked one of the deacons, he said, what's up with that guy? He was saying really inappropriate things in the line. And the deacon said, "Oh, don't mind him. He's a little senile. He just repeats everything he hears." Minister was having a bad day. You ever have a bad day? Absolutely, we've all had bad days. You ever felt like you had nothing left to give? You just were out of it? Couldn't even get up? Felt like you needed an extra boost of endurance? I don't know about you, but I think we live in what I would call an instamatic generation. We are all about the quick fix and the overnight success and the fast solution and the instant gratification. And if our expectations aren't met immediately, we tend to want to quit and go on to somewhere else. I think that spills over into our spiritual life. I think we tend to seek overnight spiritual maturity, which gives us a lot in common with the disciples. Remember the disciples who couldn't stay awake there in the Garden of Gethsemane? When the going got tough, the tough took a nap. And when the going gets tough for us, we often want to bail. But God wants so much more for us. We're in the last week, the sixth and last week of Toy Box leadership. 6 weeks of Christian leadership as seen through the lens of the toys that we played with as kids. Just as a reminder, first week was the Slinky Dog, and it was about vision. The second week was Little Green Army Men, and it was about strategy. The third week was about what Ross wanted, Legos, and it was about relationships. The fourth week was about Mr. Potato Head and communication. Last week was the Rubik's Cube, and it was about ethics. And today we're going to wrap things up by looking at Weebles, and we're going to talk about endurance. Anybody here remember Romper Room? Absolutely. I love Romper Room. And Joanne, I'm sorry to tell you, but when I was a kid, I wanted to marry Miss Lois. And I waited every day for her to see me with her magic mirror. Remember that? That was so awesome when she actually said your name. Although I've had people tell me they had a rather unusual name and she never saw them in her magic mirror. But that was also the show that introduced what was known as the punching clown. Remember the inflatable clown with the weighted bottom? And you'd punch it, and it would go down, but then it would pop right back up? Well, I didn't know this part, but in 1969, Hasbro bought the rights to Romper Room. And part of the let's be honest, all of the reason Hasbro would buy the rights to Romper Room is they wanted the marketing rights, and they wanted to market that punching clown. But they decided it was really too big for their purposes. So they made it smaller. And on July the 23rd, 1971, they introduced Weebles. Do you remember the slogan? Everybody remember it? Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. Now, the truth of the matter is, Weebles do fall down. Now, you can put them down, but they pop right back up. That's the key. They don't stay down. And because of that, these Weebles teach us about endurance. And I think endurance is a mandatory characteristic for Christians. Weebles teach us that staying down is not an option. And I was reading a story this week about Nelson Mandela, and I realized that he lived out that statement in his life. Because he went from being wrongly imprisoned from 1969 to 1990. He went from that to being president of his country. And through it all, he refused to stay down. He once said, "The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling down, but in rising every time you fall." The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling down, but in rising every time you fall. Well, what does the Bible have to say about that? There were several passages I looked at, and I picked one that's a little bit more obscure, but I think it has some key words in it that we want to touch on. It's from 1 Timothy 4, and it's 15 and 16. Hear these words. "Be diligent in these matters. Give yourself wholly to them, so that everyone may see your progress. Watch your life and your doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. I have a friend I've talked to you all about at different times. I have lots of stories about him. But this particular story involves the creek that ran behind his house. He had a creek that ran around the back of his property, his mom's property, and it curved around, and then over on that edge of his property, it went through a culvert under the road that ran in front of his house. And the culvert was a good 5 feet high. It was a big culvert, and this creek ran through there, and on the other end of the culvert, the water fell about 10 feet into a pool down there, and then went on from wherever it went from there. Well, when it rained, that creek got a lot of runoff from the subdivision that was next door, and so that creek tended to overflow its banks. One time it got really bad, and it actually swept a bunch of limbs down, and they got caught against that culvert. And it sort of created a dam there, and it caused the water to back up really badly, and it was flooding his yard and in danger of flooding his house. So he was in high school, I think, at the time, and so his mom, he was the man of the house because his dad was gone, and so his mom said, you know, see what you can do. So he goes out there, and he's standing right on the edge of the creek bank by this culvert, trying to pull these limbs, get them loose so that the water could flow through better, and the bank gave way, and he fell in. And the water sucked him up against that culvert opening, and tried to pull him through, and he hung on for a few minutes to the culvert, and he couldn't hang on anymore because the water was pulling him so hard. So the water sucked him into this culvert. The culvert is completely full of water, top to bottom, so he's completely submerged under the road in this culvert, banging around from side to side as he travels through the culvert. He gets spit out the other side, drops the 10 feet down into the pool, goes completely underwater because the pool is deeper now because of all the water, and gets his boot wedged in a tree branch down at the bottom of this pool. So he's completely underwater with his foot stuck in this tree branch. Well, he pulls and pulls because he's drowning, and he manages to rip his foot out, just ripped his ankle to shreds, but ripped his foot out of his boot, came back up, crawled out of the water, crawled back up to the road, got to his feet, bloody and battered and bruised and beaten, and made his way home. Goes in to tell his mom, and when she saw this horror that was him, she did what any good mother would do first. She took pictures of him. Now, she did take him to the hospital, but the first thing she did was take pictures of him before she did anything else. You don't drown by falling in the water. You drown by staying in the water. Did you hear what Timothy said in that passage? He said things like, be diligent. He said, give yourself wholly. And he said, persevere. What he's really saying there is about endurance. And the message of endurance applies in every situation. No matter what you face, don't run, don't give up. No matter what you go through it. Hear that. No matter what you go through it. And there will be blessings from God waiting on the other side.